In his junior year of college, right before finals, Sam finds himself staring down the barrel of a failing grade. He's trying to prep for exams and he's stressing out and he just really needs to focus, but the walls were paper thin, you'd have guys blasting music at 2 a.m. and all sorts of other shenanigans going on. Even going to the library didn't work because Sam would always either bump into a friend or an acquaintance, someone he knew, and there were just way too many distractions on campus. So Sam and his roommate Mike decide they're going to pool some money together and rent a cabin up in the mountains, just get away and lock in for the weekend. So the weekend comes, they pack their bags, get into Mike's car, and they head off for the mountains. The drive up the mountain took way longer than the boys expected. There were twisty little roads, many of which were gravel, and so it was a super bumpy ride, and they kind of had to take it a little slow to avoid kicking up too much of the gravel. Sam was streaming some music, but the higher they got, the lower the bars on his phone got, until 0 bars, no signal, and Sam kicks himself for not downloading a few playlists so that he could listen to it offline. So Sam's just sitting there, raw dogging the drive up, when finally they make it up to this last little stretch of road and just these tall pine trees everywhere. And then they turn off the main road and enter this little clearing, and there, nestled in the clearing, was the cabin. The cabin itself was nothing special. It was a single story, decently sized, smelling of pine needles, with a living space that took up the front of the cabin, a kitchen towards the back to the right, and a couple of bedrooms towards the back on the left. And in the middle was a dining area. But the defining feature of the cabin was this huge wooden wraparound porch that went right around the entire house. And every wall had these large windows giving you a 360-degree view of the woods and the mountains outside. In the daytime, it was absolutely beautiful. But as anyone who's been up in the mountains knows, it gets dark super early up there. And so by 7 o'clock, the sun had already begun to set. So Sam and Mike, they set up at the dining table. They get out their laptops, textbooks, highlighters, and of course, energy drinks. They had all the lights on inside because it was already so dark outside, and that turned the windows into these giant black mirrors just reflecting the brightly lit room back at them. So they couldn't see anything out in the yard, but they were focused on their studying anyway, so didn't really take notice of it. So a few hours go by and Sam's eyes, they're just starting to burn from staring at his screen for so long. And the only sound outside was the wind whipping through these massive pine trees. But then, right around 10:30, there was another sound, a tapping coming from the window facing the driveway. Sam stops typing and looks up at Mike, who had also stopped what he was doing. And they just stare at each other from across the table. And Sam, without saying a word, just with his facial expression, conveys to Mike like, "Did you just hear something as well, or is it all in my head?" And Mike's expression was crystal clear and conveyed back, "Yeah, I heard that too." So Sam's brain was scrambling, trying to rationalize an explanation for the sound, the tapping on the window. He tells himself that maybe it was just a loose branch blowing in the wind, and so that was tapping against the window. But deep down, he had this sinking feeling because he remembered arriving at the cabin earlier in the day, checking out the surroundings, and so he knew for a fact that there weren't any trees close enough to the front of the house to be making that noise. And before he could even convince himself of anything, he hears footsteps slowly walking from the front of the cabin, along the porch, around and towards the back where the kitchen was. And then at the kitchen window, the tapping starts again. Mike breaks the silence first, whispering frantically that they had to kill the lights so they could, actually see outside, and so they weren't just sitting ducks inside for whoever was out there. And so Sam leans over and flicks off the dining room light, dropping the whole place into complete darkness. And for some reason, to this day, they still can't explain how or why, but both Sam and Mike at the same time, like it was pure instinct, they climb down under the dining table and they just sit there for a moment, holding their breath, trying not to make a sound. For a couple of agonizing minutes, there was just nothing. Nothing happened. Sam was praying that maybe the guy got spooked when the lights turned off, but then the footsteps start up again. This time, they creak along toward the back of the house where the bedrooms were, and Sam and Mike crawl out from under the table and they slowly creep down the dark hallway, kind of matching the direction the footsteps were going towards the bedrooms, all the while terrified of making their own creaking footsteps and potentially giving away their position. So they make it into Sam's room and they crouch by the bed, and sure enough, the footsteps stop right outside his window, followed by more taps. It was then that Sam remembered that there was a landline strapped to the kitchen wall, so he signals to Mike by making like a phone sign with his hand, nodding towards the kitchen. Mike nods his head in understanding and leans in and whispers to Sam to stay and keep an eye on things, like keep tabs on the guy outside, just in case he tries to break in or if he moves on to another part of the cabin. And then Mike snuck back down the hall to try and call for help. So Sam was just left sitting there, all alone, in the pitch black bedroom, just listening to this guy outside, tapping on the glass. Every few seconds, the stranger would stop tapping, and Sam could hear a wet, squeaking sound like a hand was being slowly dragged across the glass. And then the tapping would start up all over again. And with Mike gone, Sam starts to feel the fear just rising up his whole body. He had no idea if the tapping would just continue, or if the next thing he'd hear was the sound of glass breaking or the window being forced open. And so Sam tells himself that there's no way whoever was out there knew that he was there in the room. They'd turned off the lights so no one outside could see into the cabin, and they hadn't made any noise as they crept to the bedroom. So Sam thinks there's just no way the guy outside could know he was there, and that if he did try to break in, Sam would have the element of surprise on his side. And the thought gives Sam a little comfort, but then he remembers pretty quickly that he hasn't really been in a real fight ever. And he realizes that he really wouldn't have any idea what to do if someone starts forcing their way through the window. After what felt like literal hours of sweating in the dark, Mike finally comes creeping back and he whispers that he got the owner on the phone. Mike had called the owner because he lived just about a mile down the main road and so would be much closer than the police. And the owner had told them to just make sure all the doors and windows were locked, which they were, and that he would drive up to the cabin immediately. And so they just had to sit there in the dark and wait it out. Finally, the tapping fades out, but Sam never hears any of the footsteps actually walking away from the bedroom window. And so he could only assume whoever was out there was still standing right there on the other side of the wall, just waiting for God knows what reason. Maybe 10 minutes later, a pair of headlights sweep across the living room, and Sam hears the engine of a truck revving loudly and tires spinning in the gravel as the owner comes hauling into the driveway. Sam and Mike run out to the living room and watch through the front window as the owner jumps out of his truck holding a massive flashlight and a hunting rifle. Then the owner starts just yelling into the woods, demanding to know who was out there. Sam scrambles to unlock the door and they spill out onto the front porch into the freezing air. The owner turns to them and says he's just seen this huge dark figure hauling ass away from the back corner of the cabin and disappearing into the tree line. The owner then shines his flashlight down at the porch, and since it had been pouring rain all afternoon, the driveway and the area around the cabin had become muddy, and so the beam of the flashlight lights up this trail of massive muddy footprints just tracking all the way around the house. Not shoe prints, not boot prints, but footprints, massive ones. And Sam just felt sick as he follows these muddy tracks with his eyes, seeing how they wrap around the cabin from the front window, then towards the back where the kitchen was, and then all the way to the other side where the bedrooms were. And so Sam and Mike decide that there's just no way that they're going to stay at the cabin anymore. So they bundle everything up, not even bothering to pack really, they just wanted to get the hell out of there. So Sam grabs his laptop off the table, scoops up his clothes and his books, just dumps everything into the trunk of Mike's car. Mike does the same, and they follow the owner's taillights all the way back down the mountain and onto the highway. Sam never found out who or what was out there that night. And even now, years later, he gets super paranoid and has to close the blinds if he's sitting anywhere near a window at night. Coming out of COVID, Ethan was really starting to feel the squeeze. Like so many others, His shifts at work had been cut down to basically nothing during the lockdown, but I guess you could say he was lucky in the sense that he didn't lose his job entirely. But inflation's out of control, rent in the city is getting stupidly expensive, and the few shifts he could pick up at work coming out of lockdown really weren't doing much for his bank account. So he signs up to be a driver, and at the time, this feels like a win for Ethan. He figures he'd just cruise around listening to music or podcasts or his favorite YouTube channel telling scary stories and just watch the city lights go by as the cash rolls in. People were finally being let out of the house, he thought, so work would be plenty. But Ethan finds out pretty quick that the real money was only out there during the late night weekend shifts, which he found incredibly exhausting. You see, Ethan was what you'd call a bit of an introvert. And so during these late night shifts, he'd have to deal with people who'd had way too many drinks and lost all respect for personal boundaries. But when those surge prices hit, he just grit his teeth and kept on driving. Now, things were going fine for about 3 months until this one night in October. It was freezing cold and a thick fog had settled over everything, making the streetlights just look like blurry yellow smudges up in the air. Ethan had been sitting at a gas station for about 45 minutes. It had been a really quiet night so far, and he's feeling the chills seep in through the door. He's thinking he should just call it a night. But then his phone lights up, and he hears the familiar ping of a ride coming in. So Ethan looks at his screen, and his heart sinks a little bit because the pickup was way out at the northern edge of town. And out there was this massive housing development that was left unfinished because the developer had gone bust halfway through construction. And he knew the place, and that it was just a bunch of unfinished houses and roads and didn't lead anywhere. And nobody lived out there, and so he pauses and he thinks to himself, well, that's weird. Maybe it's a prank, just some kids wanting to waste someone's time for kicks. But then he sees that it's a super long ride with a huge fare, and he really needed the money. So he thinks to himself that he's willing to take the risk because opportunities like this didn't come around very often. So he puts the car in gear and heads off into the dark. But the drive up is a bit of a mission. Because of the heavy fog, visibility was close to zero. Ethan could barely see past the hood of his car, so even though he was on the highway, he finds he has to drive way slower than the speed limit. And to make things worse, the further he heads out of town, the less streetlights there are, until the only light around was coming from his headlights. And so he's just creeping along at what feels like a snail's pace, reminding himself that this would all be worth it for the fare. And then he arrives at the entrance of the development, he turns off the highway and heads in through the entrance. Up until now, Ethan's only really been worried about whether or not this is a prank, whether or not this is a waste of his time. But as he enters this development, all he can see is rows and rows of empty, unfinished houses. Some were just wooden frames, while others had plastic sheeting wrapped all around them so you couldn't see what was inside. And there's no streetlights here at all. And he can't really see anything other than what his headlights are, currently shining on. Add to that the fog, and Ethan starts to feel a little nervous. But he tells himself that he's already here, he drove all the way out here, and so he couldn't just turn back now. So he decides he just, at the very least, needs to go to the pickup point and see what's up. So Ethan's driving through the development, trying to get to the pickup point, but because the roads here hadn't been mapped out yet, he couldn't just rely on the GPS, because sometimes it would tell him to turn where there was no turn, or it led him down into a dead end. But pretty soon, Ethan manages to work his way through this maze of unfinished houses and roads, and he arrives at the pickup point, which is at the end of this long cul-de-sac. So he parks, sits there, and waits for someone to come up to the car. He waits for a few minutes, and no one shows up. And he thinks to himself, oh man, I'm such an idiot, coming all the way out here. Obviously, this had to be a prank. Like, who calls for a ride and to be picked up out here in a place like this, out in the middle of nowhere? And so he's just about to call it quits and head home when he sees someone step out of the darkness and stop right at the edge of his headlights. It's a girl. She looks young, probably early 20s, and she's hugging her jacket like really tight against the cold. And she looks like she's dressed like she was either going to or just coming back from a party. And so Ethan, He looks at this and he feels this huge wave of relief, and he breathes out this huge sigh, thinking she was probably just some kid who got ditched either coming or going to a party and needed a ride home. So he lets off the brake and rolls up slowly, stopping about 10 feet away, expecting her to walk up and hop in the back of the car. But she doesn't move. She just stands there in the dirt, staring at him through the glass with these blank eyes and her face saying that she really didn't want to be there. So Ethan rolls down the passenger side window just a crack and asks her if she was the one who called for the ride. She didn't answer right away. She just nods real slow, and then she asks him if he can help her load some stuff into the trunk. Now immediately this raises red flags in Ethan's mind. No one ever asks him to help them load anything into the car unless they were heading to the airport or something. Never mind that they were essentially in the middle of a ghost town at night. So Ethan looks around a bit, squinting into the shadows, but he doesn't see any luggage or anything really. So he tells her he'll drive up a little bit, pull up next to whatever it is she needs to load, and he'll just pop the trunk and she could throw it in. And the girl shakes her head and she starts insisting that the stuff was way too heavy for her, and she starts begging him to just please help me, I can't lift this stuff on my own. And right then, Ethan starts to get a real sick feeling. Something was totally off here. How the hell is this girl out here in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of stuff that's too heavy for her to carry? And the other weird thing was that her eyes kept jumping over the roof of his car, like she was looking at something on the road behind him. And so Ethan offers once again to just pop the trunk, let her throw in whatever she needs to throw in, when out of nowhere, the girl just starts screaming at him, like demanding that he get out and help her. And that was it as far as Ethan was concerned. He'd had enough. He didn't need to hear anything else. He reaches down, puts the car into drive, but just as he's about to take off, he hears this scraping sound like metal dragging against asphalt, coming from behind. He glances at the rear view, and in the dim red glow of his taillights, he sees this tall guy in a dark hoodie sliding out of the fog, creeping up on his door. The guy was holding a sledgehammer. Ethan was just about to floor it when from in front of him, this pair of blinding headlights flick on, and this black SUV rolls out of the fog, turning sideways to block the road. It was a setup, Ethan realizes. The girl was bait to get him out of the car. So at this point, adrenaline starts pumping through his veins. He knew he had to get out of there no matter what. Whatever these guys wanted with him, he knew it wouldn't be any good. But what can he do? The road in front is blocked by the SUV, and there's this guy behind him with the sledgehammer. Without any good options really, in a split-second decision, Ethan just stomps on the gas. His tires scream as they spin against the pavement for a second before they catch, and then he hears the girl scream something as she dives out of the way. Ethan aims his car right at the SUV, but he knew he couldn't just hit it dead on or he could kill his engine and just be trapped there. So at the very last second, he yanks the wheel hard to the right, and he feels his car jump up onto the curb, and he goes flying over what was supposed to be someone's front yard, praying the whole time that he wouldn't catch a flat tire. The side of his car scrapes against the SUV's bumper as it flies past, and he doesn't stop there. Ethan keeps flooring it, bouncing back onto the road and flying through the fog. He looks back and he sees the SUV's brake lights flare up, but they didn't come after him. He figures they realized he wasn't going to be an easy target and wasn't worth the trouble. Ethan doesn't let up on the gas until he's miles away, back under the bright lights of the highway. He pulls into the first gas station he sees, parking right under the brightest light they had, and he calls 911. When the cops show up, he tells them the whole thing. The girl, the guy with the sledgehammer, the SUV, everything. They looked at his car and they saw the damage running across the side of the car from scraping against the SUV, but they also find this massive dent in his trunk. Turns out the guy with the sledgehammer had gotten off one, maybe two solid hits in. Ethan hadn't even noticed in the thick of things. The very next day, Ethan quits being a driver. He couldn't stand the idea of letting another stranger in his car. Luckily, work started to pick back up, and so he didn't really need the money anymore. In the fall of 2009, Isaiah was just a regular 22-year-old guy trying to keep his head above water. His life was an endless, exhausting loop of waking up early, working all day at a cafe downtown, and coming back to a tiny, overpriced apartment that smelled of mildew. He didn't have much more to his name other than the clothes on his back. In his bedroom, there was a mattress on the floor and a milk crate that he was using as a nightstand. Money was insanely tight, so he'd spend hours every night on sites like Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, hunting for anything he could either resell or use to make the place feel less like a prison cell and more like a real home. So one night, Isaiah stumbles on this listing for a solid wooden dresser. And the thing looked like it was in perfect condition. Dark wood, solid, the kind of vintage thing that usually goes for a couple $100 easy. And the seller only wanted 30. So he messages the seller right away, and the guy fires back instantly, telling Isaiah he could come grab it that same night if he wanted to. It was pushing 9 o'clock and it had just started pouring down rain, but Isaiah was so broke and so desperate that he didn't want to risk someone else coming in, snatching up the dresser before him. So Isaiah begs his roommate for the keys to his old pickup and heads out into the rain. The address takes Isaiah out past the city limits, out into the rural farming area. Once he got off the main highway, the streetlights vanish and he was just in pitch black in every direction. He ends up crawling down this long dirt road that was barely even a road anymore, just totally swallowed up by darkness. The rain was coming down so hard it sounded like gravel hitting the roof of the truck. And the windshield wipers seemed to just be smearing the rain around without really helping a whole lot with visibility. Finally, his GPS tells him he's arrived. Isaiah pulls up to this massive 2-story farmhouse that looked like something straight out of a horror movie. It was just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, stained and weathered like it hadn't been maintained in years. He couldn't see another house for at least a mile in any direction. The whole property was super neglected. His headlights swept over a yard totally choked with weeds. There's rusted out car frames and old washing machines hidden under blue tarps. The house itself was completely dark, except for this one sickly yellow porch light that kept buzzing and flickering away. So Isaiah kills the engine, and the sudden silence of the truck is immediately replaced with the drumming of the rain. He sits there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the porch, and it was raining so hard that everything looked blurry like he'd put on a pair of glasses that weren't his. He'd parked as close as he possibly could to the steps, but he knew even at that short distance, he'd probably still get drenched getting out. So he takes a moment, hypes himself up a bit, prepares to face the freezing rain, then he throws up his hood, yanks the door open, and jumps out of the truck. His boots sink into the thick, freezing mud as he sprints towards the house. He reaches the porch, knocks on the front door, and just stood there shivering. His jeans already soaked through, the porch roof not really doing a whole lot because the rain was actually blowing sideways almost. After what felt like forever, the door clicks open, and standing there was an elderly man, maybe pushing 70. He looked incredibly frail, all hunched over like his spine was giving out on him, and he was wearing this filthy, threadbare flannel shirt and baggy jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. Isaiah clears his throat, tells the guy that he's here to pick up the dresser. The old man just slowly nods and tells him to come inside. Now, for a split second, Isaiah hesitates at the thought of entering the stranger's house in the middle of the night. But he was freezing, soaking wet, and this old dude honestly looked like a stiff breeze could knock him over. And he felt kind of bad for the guy. And Isaiah thought about the money he could make from all this, so he wipes his muddy boots on the mat and steps over the threshold. The second the door closes behind him, the air in the house just becomes suffocating. It was heavy and weirdly hot. The place smelled nauseating like a mix of wet dog and stale cigarettes. The lighting was terrible, just a couple of dusty floor lamps casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. And without saying a word, the old man just starts shuffling down this dark, narrow hallway leading deeper into the back of the house. Isaiah follows him, but as he's walking down the hallway, his heart starts beating a little faster and a little faster. The eeriness of the situation was really starting to sink in. The old man leads him into a kitchen, which was just a total mess. The sink was overflowing with moldy dishes, and the floor was sticky. The old guy stops in front of a door, grabs the handle, pulls it open, and reaches inside as if to flick on a light switch, but nothing happens. No lights turn on, and all Isaiah could see was a staircase dropping down into a basement, basically just looked like it disappeared into this black void. The old man turns around and tells Isaiah that the dresser is down in the basement, and he says that he can bring the dresser to the stairs, but his back was too bad to bring it up the stairs alone. And then he asks Isaiah if he could come down and help him haul it up the stairs. At this moment, Isaiah feels his hair stand on end. He stares into that black void and alarm bells start going off in his head. Something was terribly wrong. He forces out a smile and politely asks the old man if he could maybe bring the dresser to the bottom of the stairs so he could check it out using the light on his phone. The moment he said that, the old man's face completely changes. All pretense of friendliness just vanishes in a second. His expression goes dead, his eyes become hard. He takes a quick step toward Isaiah and in a harsh tone accuses him of coming just to waste his time, and then demands that they go down into the basement, grab the damn thing, and so they could just get this over with. Now, Isaiah's never been in a situation like this before. He'd only been in a handful of confrontations in his life, and none were even close to this. But without really thinking, his fight or flight response kicks into overdrive, and it tells him, clear as day, to fly, run, get the hell out of there. So he takes a step back, and he tells the old guy, you know what, never mind, I've changed my mind, and he didn't want to buy the dresser anymore. He then spins around and speed walks back down the creepy hallway toward the front door. But he was barely out of the kitchen when he hears a sound that just makes his blood run cold. It was coming from the basement, from deep down in the dark. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming up the wooden stairs. First one, then another, slowly just creaking their way up toward the kitchen. Somebody else was in the house. Isaiah whips his head back around and looks at the old man, and the guy wasn't hunched over frail anymore. Instead, he's standing upright, and he lunges forward and grabs at Isaiah's jacket and tries to drag him towards the basement. But Isaiah's running on pure adrenaline at this point, and he shoves the old man back with a strength even he didn't know he had. The guy goes flying back, slams hard into the kitchen counter, falls to the floor. Isaiah didn't even wait to see if he would get up. He just took off, sprinting down the narrow hallway faster than he'd ever moved in his entire life. Grabs the door, yanks it open, throws himself out the door onto the porch into the freezing rain. He could hear the old man back in the house just screaming absolute bloody murder from the kitchen. Just furious, but he didn't care at all. He scrambles into his roommate's truck, slams it in reverse, floors it out of there. He fishtailed backwards out the muddy driveway, didn't take his foot off the gas until he was miles away, and finally saw the orange glow of the streetlights illuminating the rain. When he got home and finally had a moment to calm down, really settle his nerves, Isaiah calls the police to report the incident. He gave them the exact address he'd saved in his maps, and the officer told him they would send a car out to check it out. Isaiah then sits there in his living room for what felt like hours, until a county deputy finally calls him back. The deputy told him they'd gone out to the farmhouse, swept the entire property, but the house was locked up tight, and nobody appeared to be home. The deputy said that they would keep an eye on things, see if anyone came back, so they could be questioned. But he told Isaiah straight up that with things the way they were, unfortunately, it would come down to his word against theirs. You wouldn't be surprised to hear Isaiah never looked at Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace again.